Okay, so hey everyone, and welcome back to Default Global. This is where we dive into chats with entrepreneurs and remote work experts from all corners of the globe. And today we're super excited to have Dee Coakley, a CEO at Boundless, joining us today. Dee, it is fantastic to have you here today.
Really good to be here, Vic. Thanks so much for asking me along.
Absolutely. Dee, you have an impressive background in the remote work industry, right? So could you please introduce yourself and share a bit about your journey leading up to your current role as a CEO of Boundless?
Sure. So I started my career doing something very different. I spent 7 years in the music industry working with
Hmm.
artists like Beyonce and Morrissey and
Wow.
Guns N' Roses. Yeah. I was working in commercial planning and marketing roles. So I wasn't, nobody was paying me to stand on a stage.
Hmm.
Um, and I knew I wanted to move into back then we were calling it, mobile and online. I
Hmm.
wanted to get experience in the tech space. This was 15 years ago when the tech sector was very underdeveloped, or the startup scene was very underdeveloped compared to where it is today. And at that time, I thought I'd go and do a couple of years in tech and that then I'd start a music tech startup or go back to music with the knowledge and experience I gained in tech. But I think within 4 or 5 days of being in tech, I thought, no, these are my people. This is where I want to be. And, I never looked
Hmm.
back. So I joined a company called Masabi, I was living in London at the time, a UK based company that handles mobile ticketing for the mass transit sector. So if you've ever
Hmm.
bought a train ticket on your mobile handset in the UK or on the Long Island Railroad in New York or the MBTA in Boston or lots of other places, that's their tech behind that.
Okay.
And quite quickly, I became COO there. It was a very small early stage company when I joined, but has grown and progressed a lot over the years. Subsequently, I was with a company called Bizimply, which is a workforce management software solutions. That was my first foray into HR tech. I met my
Hmm.
co-founder Emily there. She was my
Hmm.
first ever internationally remote employee. She was a lead engineer there, and she came to us and said, I'd really love to do a ski season in France, but I
Hmm.
like working for you guys. I'd like to keep my job. Can you support me? And we thought, oh, how on earth do you employ someone in France? So we said, oh, it's only a few months, sure. And, it was about 9 years ago. She still lives there. It's such a nice place. She's never left.
Yeah, can
And
imagine.
then after, yeah, it's a cool place to live. After that, I joined another Irish company called Accionista, which is an interactive video tech company. And this was where I really encountered this reality and the challenges of international teams.
Hmm.
We were hiring people to be co-located out of our HQ office, which is quite close to where I am right now in Dublin in
Hmm.
Ireland. But we were getting amazing applicants from people all over the world. They were starting at our HQ office, but over time, people would request moves back to home countries or to new countries. And these were super talented people. They built our product. We loved working with them. So across the board, we were supporting them with those moves back to their home country. So very organically over time, we ended up with this internationally distributed team. And I had to set about each time I was figuring out how to employ this person or these people in this new country.
Hmm.
So in that job, I set up employment, and we can talk a little bit more about what setting up employment means. But I made sure that we were fully compliant for having these people working for us out of France, Spain, Germany, Croatia,
Hmm.
a whole range of different countries. And it was really difficult. It was a real challenge, and that's what left me thinking there has to be a better way of doing this. It was just such a nightmare for me. Literally kept me awake at night, and that was when I started looking into what building a solution might look like, and that's where Boundless came from.
Okay, that's very impressive background. And for our audience who may not be familiar maybe with this concept, right? I mean, employer of record. Can you explain what an employer of record is and how it helps companies to employ remote workers in different countries, continents, different time zones?
Sure. Let me start with describing the problem with having workers
Mm-hmm.
over, because that will help you understand why we have the solution that we have.
Mm-hmm.
So, quite often, I always say anyone that's encountered this problem, it's a really easy sell. Anyone that's dealt with the problem of handling operations for workers in multiple countries knows it's a nightmare. And those
Yeah.
people say to us all the time, your solution, it's a good value solution, and what you're doing solves very real problems. But if you've never been a hiring manager or someone involved in ops for overseas workers, most people are pretty unaware of the challenges involved. So we always say there are two buckets of challenges. The first one is the employment stuff, the HR
Mm-hmm.
stuff. So if, for example, you are a US company and you identify a worker you'd like to have on your team, but they live in France, that
Mm-hmm.
person is entitled to the employment protections of French law. So wherever a worker is at any point in time, they are always entitled to the protections of the legislation, the laws in that country.
Mm-hmm.
So if you are a UK company and you have people in France and in Singapore and in Canada, suddenly you're having to get to grips with the laws of all of those countries. And those workers all need to be set up in an employment agreement that's compliant with the laws of the country that they're in.
Right.
You as a company, you have to meet your employer obligations. So that's the HR and the employment piece. On the other side, there's the payroll piece. And part of that is taxes, benefits.
Mm-hmm.
So again, everyone has a tax residency somewhere in the world, where usually it's where you live. And your employer has to comply with the tax laws of that country, and they have to submit employer taxes, and usually they will have to handle your taxes, your employee taxes on your behalf in that country. That means they have to be registered with the local tax authority, do all of their filings. So all of that's it's really complex. It's hard work. It
Mm-hmm.
takes time. It's expensive to do. Companies need to have people that understand how to do all of this if you're doing it directly. So they're the problems that Boundless solves. And how we solve those problems is Boundless, our company, we have a network of infrastructure all over the world. And this is what makes us quite different to a lot of other employers of record. Other employers of record are essentially sales agent front ends for other people's product. But for us, we own all of our own infrastructure. We have full control over quality and the employee experience. So we own entities around the world. We have tax registrations. We have relationships with the local benefits providers. So our customers don't need to have those things. They can
Mm-hmm.
piggyback on our infrastructure.
Mm-hmm.
And we do that by acting as the employer of record. So Boundless is an employer of record.
Mm-hmm.
And we act as the legal employer on our customers' behalf in these countries. So we handle all the paperwork. We fully arm the customer with all of the information that they need. Not too much information. If you go Googling, you'll get swamped, and it's very hard to distill that down and know what you need to be doing when. But we really hold our customers' hands and help them to understand that. We process the payroll, file the taxes, and we make the payments to the worker, the tax authorities, and benefits providers. So,
Mm-hmm.
the long explanation, but that's what an employer of record does.
Okay, sounds good. And do you provide any other options except this, besides employer of record? I mean, for example, some of your competitors do this, like they help companies to work with contractors, to hire contractors, right? Does your company provide that?
So for us at Boundless, my background was being a chief operating officer, so
Mm-hmm.
I'd always had responsibility for the legal
Right.
and finance functions where I worked.
Mm-hmm.
So for me, when I was looking to solve these problems, the problem I was looking to solve was a compliance problem.
Right. Mm-hmm.
So Boundless is a compliance solution. The reality is independent contracting is not compliant long term in lots of countries, that we can talk about that a little bit more.
Mm-hmm.
But for us, we wanted to focus on being a full compliant solution for when companies wanted to have full workers as part of their team. So what we wanted to deliver was an experience that was seamless for the worker and for the company. These workers should feel like anyone else on your team that you're employing directly. So we've always just operated a full direct employment model. So we don't support contracting. Our focus is really full compliant employment.
Got it. Thank you. In one of your interviews, you kind of emphasized the importance of evaluating employer of record providers based on their commitment to compliance and in-depth knowledge of country-specific laws, right? So can you share some maybe tips for founders, executives on how to assess employer of record providers, right? What are the maybe key questions they should ask to ensure they're partnering with a reliable and trustworthy employer of record provider?
So a really, really good point. Employer of record, it is complex and it is a compliance product. So it's not about picking any provider. If the problem you're trying to solve is a compliance problem, you need to be sure that the company you're working with is fully above board and that they are solving the problem and the challenge of compliance. And the responsibilities that you're passing to this company, these are really important responsibilities. Being an employer it's tough, right? Particularly in a lot of countries, in LATAM, in Europe, employees get really great protections, particularly a lot of US hiring managers and leaders. It's a big challenge. There's a big cultural difference, but there are big legislative differences between, for example, ending an employment agreement with an employee in most US states compared to, say, most European countries. So you need to be working with a provider that is going to make sure you're on the right side of the law, make sure you're not being fined, but will also give you the support that you need. So when you're looking at options for employer of record, there are a number of questions you should ask. And the first key question is, do they own their infrastructure? Because that's going to be a big indicator of the quality that you will get from this company.
By the infrastructure, you mean like local entities in different countries?
Exactly. So who will the employer actually be? Is it the company you're talking to? Or is it going to be some third party? And a lot of a very, very large proportion of the companies out there saying they are an employer of record, they are not actually an employer of record, or they're not in many countries. They are actually a sales agent for other employers of record.
Okay.
So, a VC said to me a little while ago, I would describe them as sales agents, but a VC said he would describe them as lead gen agencies for the actual employers of record at the back. So you want to know that the person you're talking to and the company that you're doing due diligence on and getting a feel for, you want to know that they control the whole experience. So what you're asking is, do you own your own entities? If the answer to that is no, or they might, they might give a vague answer, like saying we do in most countries, you should ask for a list of which countries they actually own their own entities in and which countries they're working through partners in. Now, of course, there can be some good partners, but there are a lot of partners that are not great partners. And the issue is that if you have multiple layers of communication, if you're talking to one salesperson, but they're selling someone else's product, and then when you have an issue or a challenge, you talk to your customer support person at the company you bought from, but they're then getting information. And remember, this is often very sensitive legal information. They're getting advice from another company elsewhere, and then that's coming back to you. All of these layers mean things can be slow, and there can be issues with accuracy, and your experience can be really poor. So first question is, do they own their own entities? Who will the actual employer be? Second question is around response times. And we've been quite shocked recently when we've signed up new customers that are coming to us from other employers of record. We have a customer that's currently in the process of transferring a few hundred employees over to us from 2 other employers of record. They were telling us that when they were submitting support queries, they were not getting a response for between 3 to 4 days. They just weren't hearing anything back at all. And then when there were issues with payroll, if there were mistakes or inaccuracies, it was taking between 3 to 4 payroll cycles to get those fixed. So for us at Boundless, we respond on average within 1 hour. That's even when we get queries in the middle of the night or outside, our office hours. We will still always, on average, respond within 1 hour. We never let an employee go into a subsequent payroll cycle without having a payroll issue resolved. And these things are really important because people getting paid and getting paid the right amount on time every month.
Right.
You will never have happy workers if there are issues with their payroll. It doesn't matter what else you get right. People need to be paid the right amount. And of course, there's the fact that you have legal obligations to take care of all of this. So asking about those response times is important. Quality of their materials. So most employers of record won't give you access to see an employment agreement until you've signed up with them. And that's understandable because it's their IP, right?
Yep.
They don't want to be giving away their IP free of charge. But once you have signed commercial terms, they should be open to sharing an employment agreement with you. You can ask to see employment agreements from a couple of different countries. They should not be identical. The laws in each country are different. Norms for employment agreements in each country are different. So they will probably look quite different, but there should be some alignment in quality. And there should be some consistency between those agreements. If they vary wildly, you might want to ask questions about why they're varying wildly. If the named employer of record on each is different, you're more likely to get those wild variations in employment agreements. You'll need to ask about who you'll be dealing with, who will answer your queries, and you should have direct access to country-specific HR compliance experts, and you should have access to payroll experts. Now, a good customer experience is you'll have a primary point of contact, and that's the person you'll first go to. That's a great customer experience. But the employer of record on their own team should have payroll experts and HR compliance experts that you can talk with directly if there's an issue. And for us at Boundless, that's hugely important.
Yeah.
So there are some key things to look out for.
Yeah, absolutely. And how many countries do you support?
So we support 25 countries.
25 countries.
Heavy concentration in Europe. We're an Irish HQ'd company. So we cover a very large proportion of European countries, but we also cover places like Australia, New Zealand, Singapore. Canada is really big for us. Brazil, Mexico, Chile.
Okay.
So really good spread.
Okay. And you have your own legal entities in those countries, right?
The only country that's an exception is Brazil. Brazil has some very specific legislation around employment that means we need to work with a local partner. But all of those other countries, it's Boundless entities, Boundless team members that you're dealing with. Boundless is the direct employer. Yeah.
Okay. And just 25, you said, right? 25 countries. And how is it possible to kind of stay up to date with the legal requirements in each of those countries you operate in, and how do you ensure your clients remain compliant as these changes occur? Do you have local lawyers in each of those countries, your own lawyers who are physically there, or how does it work?
Really good question. And I would say with a lot of hard work, it is hard work. This stuff's not easy. And I think that's a bit of a challenge in the employer of record space, that a lot of players entered this space at speed, particularly once COVID kicked off. And they were really focused on growth at speed and focused on customer acquisition and revenue growth. And so they just ran at it and did everything they could as quickly as possible. I'm actually the only founder in the space with an ops background, surprisingly. Most of the other founders in the space came from tech backgrounds or from other disciplines, sales, marketing. I knew inherently, because I had solved some of these problems myself before, I knew it takes time. It takes time to build quality. to build a really quality solution. So for us, we've taken a really considerate approach. We've added countries where we know there is demand and where
Mm-hmm.
there are high friction points around
Mm-hmm.
being an employer in those countries. So we have our own HR compliance team and our own global payroll team that are in-house with us. And those people, there's a split across the team. Each person is an expert in a number of countries, but we have hired people with experience and knowledge in specific countries.
Mm-hmm.
And then on the ground in each country, we work with a best-in-class firm of local employment lawyers and a firm of accountants and tax experts. So when a customer reaches out to us with queries, they will, in the first instance, interact with our team. And if it's a question that we've answered many times before and where we have the knowledge in-house, we'll answer them immediately. But where it's something very specialist or tricky or an unusual situation, we will go and speak to our lawyers in country. And all of this is included. And we don't charge additional fees for this. All of this is included. In terms of staying on top of changes in country, we depend very heavily on those in-country experts. And we do regular check-ins with them where we check in on any legislative changes. As you can imagine, the new year is always a really busy time for us as we come towards the end of an old year and enter the new year. A lot of countries will have changes at that point in time. So that time of year, our marketing team will be really busy updating all of our country guides, making sure our HR compliance team are fully aware of and on top of changes that are coming down the road in those countries. We produce a lot of content, usually around that time of year, talking about the changes that we're seeing in different countries. So it's just about being very proactive and having the right connections in country to experts that, because of the nature of the work they're doing every day of the week, they're on top of these changes. And then for us, we have relationships with our customers. We proactively reach out to our customers and make them aware.
Okay. Sounds good. And let's maybe talk a bit about employees, right? So in one of your interviews, you mentioned that offering secure and stable employment can be a sort of an effective recruitment and retention tool for companies, right, that are hiring. But based on, for example, my experience and recent research that we did in our company, a significant portion of, senior tech talent. I work mostly in the tech industry, so I'm just, from this space, talking from this space. In maybe in specific countries like Brazil, Argentina, Colombia, right? So, which are facing some inflation, hyperinflation problems, right? So tech talent, senior tech talent in those countries, they prefer not to be hired through the employer of record model. There are a number of reasons for this, but the most obvious one, they often choose B2B contract and use the compensation for stability, right? They prefer to get their compensation in US dollars or in euros or, in some stable currency. And this preference may cause companies using this employer of record model to miss out on a huge pool of talent, tech talent, and usually we're talking about the best ones. And how does maybe your company address this issue, and maybe you can offer a solution that benefits both employers and employees, maybe ensuring they have access to compensation in USD in some stable currency or whatever. Maybe there are some other options.
Yeah, so really good question. And it's very, very country specific.
Right.
So you mentioned there are a lot of Latin American countries. I know you're based in Ukraine. Ukraine has very specific legislation around contractors. That means being an independent contractor is very attractive there. Yeah. So it's country specific. And certainly we'd see a lot of that coming out of Latin America. On the flip side, there are countries where it's absolutely not preferable to be an independent contractor. So I'm based in Ireland, for example. The average Irish person has never done a personal tax return in their lives. I was talking to an American about this the other day. Countries like France, right throughout the US, every individual has to submit their own personal tax return every year. So the concept of submitting a tax return is not daunting to someone in those countries. In Ireland, there is no requirement to do this, and it's the same in many European countries. And employment rights and employment protections are held in very high regard in many European countries as well. So people living in those countries, and it happens a lot with US companies looking to hire people as independent contractors in Ireland, for example, where really great talent will often say, absolutely not. Why would I work as an independent contractor? It's in no way, there is no tax benefit to doing it in certain countries. They'll say, if I do that, you can just drop me at any point in time. I have no protections. If I'm an employee, I'll be entitled to severance pay, notice periods. If you're an employee, you get maternity, paternity leave, paid sick leave. There are lots of benefits. Some countries throughout Europe, paid sick leave, for example, you can be off work sick for very long periods of time and be paid a very large proportion of your original salary. Whereas if you're an independent contractor, you often won't be entitled, or usually you will not be entitled to that. So depending on the country, the opposite can be true, and people will refuse to take jobs unless they're going to be full-time permanent employees. In the countries where contracting is preferential, and I mentioned Ukraine has a really preferential income tax rate for people that work as independent contractors. The Ukrainian government have obviously seen an opportunity over many years to attract those jobs to Ukraine and to make it attractive for local workers, and to put companies in a position where they don't have these heavy duty employer obligations they have in other countries. So that's preferential there. So what we see with companies that are hiring really globally, they will make decisions on a country by country basis. Now, every company is different, and a company's goals will be very tailored for that company, what the company does, what their approach is in terms of people, and also the stage and size of the company. So what a company's approach is around people and hiring this year might be different in 3 years' time as the company evolves. Some companies across the board will want everyone working for them to be a full-time permanent employee. They may have reasons where they want these people as headcount. So for example, a company that feels they might sell at some point in time, if it's a smaller company and they're feeling that they might want to do a sale of the company to a larger company at some point in the future, it might be really important for them to have this really great team. And in a company sale, the company will have a higher value if it has a team of value, but that team needs to be permanent employees. If they're independent contractors, they would not form part of the company valuation. So that can be important to a company that's hiring. Another company, it might be really important to them to have flexibility around headcount. In order to improve their metrics, they might want to keep the headcount low and have people as independent contractors. So sometimes they're their goals. But what always coexists alongside this is the law in the country that people are based in. And it happens all the time that workers might have a preference for an independent contractor agreement. They might have a preference to be paid in US dollars, but in some countries that's just simply not legal. It is against the law, and the company will be breaking the law to do that. Now, people break laws all over the world every day of the week. Some people have a much more flexible approach to that, or some companies do. And again, that can be very dependent on stage and size of the company. But for a lot of companies, particularly bigger companies, they are simply going to say, like, I understand why you want this. That's very attractive, understandably. But we will be breaking the law if we gave that to you. And there are many countries where payroll can only be paid in a local currency. And there are many countries where it must be paid through a traditional local bank account. You cannot even pay from a foreign bank account.
Mhm.
So where that is the case, often the company will come to an arrangement with the worker to make sure that they're compensated, or they're bridging that gap
Mhm.
on the pay, or they come up with some other kind of employment terms or benefits for the worker that make it
Mhm.
attractive. Because, you know, every company in the world now with remote workforces, you're competing with every other company in the world, and this is really, really good for employees
Mhm.
or workers, whether you're an independent contractor or an employee, because you have bargaining power, and top tech talent will always be in demand, whatever the market is like. And they have these bargaining chips. They can negotiate and say, well, if you won't pay me in US dollars, then I want you to cover my private
Yeah.
medical insurance, or, maybe even something like my kids' school fees or something like that.
Mhm.
Um, so there's always an opportunity there for top talent. There's always an opportunity to negotiate and come up with some other kind of agreement.
Yeah, totally makes sense. But one more maybe issue with employer of record that I see all the time. I mean, not maybe all the time, but some of my current clients and partners, they ask about this and ask some advice, and I would like to hear your opinion on this because considering the fact that employer of record model is not widely kind of accepted from the legal perspective in some countries, again, Latin America countries, right? So, and it doesn't kind of create direct legal relationship between the company and employees, right? So, how does your company probably mitigate the risk associated with companies not having this full control over their employees, and potentially maybe there are some negative consequences for both parties with this?
Excellent question. And you posed the question earlier, how should companies evaluate or assess
Right.
a prospective employer of record? And this is one of the things they should be looking at. They should ask questions about this. So you've quite rightly pointed out that employer of record is not recognized in every territory.
Mm-hmm.
And how it is recognized in the countries where it is recognized, it varies country to country.
Mm-hmm.
So there are some countries where there is legislation that's really clear. So Germany has really clear legislation. German employment law allows for a model of employer of record, and every employer of record operating out of Germany has to be licensed. It's a regulated space. So Boundless holds a license that's called an AUG license, and there are specific parameters and restrictions. So we are limited to employing people, and we can only employ people for 18 months in Germany, and then the company would have to employ them directly. And so there are some parameters around it. So some countries really clear, Germany, black and white, everyone knows where they stand.
Right.
France, for example, is a very different model. France has a model called portage salarial. There is no English translation for these
Mm-hmm.
words. It's a uniquely French
Mm-hmm.
model, and it's somewhere between employment and independent contracting. It is neither of those things, but kind of both of those things at the same time.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
In France, and again, it's a regulated space, we have to be licensed. So in France, technically, from a legal perspective, Boundless actually provides a service to the worker, not to the company, not to our customer company.
Mm-hmm. Interesting.
But for all of the companies that we work with, they don't expect their workers to pay fees to us. They don't expect their workers to have to make arrangements with us.
Mm-hmm.
So we have an arrangement with our customer, and then Boundless provides services from a legal perspective to the worker, but we absorb the cost of that into our customer's fees so that the worker is not having to pay for this. So the paperwork is very different. The contracts are very different somewhere like France. Then somewhere like the UK, for example, employer of record is not a regulated space. It's not expressly set out in law, but there is nothing in employment law or contract law that restricts or prohibits employer of record from operating in that country. So it's just a straight up employer of record arrangement. For us, the model we operate in countries like that is a tripartite co-employment arrangement, where Boundless is named as the employer of record with responsibility for compliance, processing payroll, filing taxes, and so on. The customer is named on the employment agreement, as well as the organization that owns the relationship with the worker. They allocate work and manage performance, and then the worker is the third party to that tripartite co-employment agreement. There are some countries where tripartite agreements are not recognized, and there are some countries where co-employment is not recognized. And in some countries, Boundless has to be the only named employer. In some other countries, the customer has more responsibility as the employer, and Boundless is named as a service provider to that company. And that, that's dictated by law in many countries. So there are other countries where it's a bit of a gray area, like Poland. It's not super clear. When we were going into Poland, when you ask a prospective employer of record about this stuff, our salespeople can all talk about this stuff because we all talk about it all the time. When you ask, well, what different operating models do you operate in different countries? Why have you made that decision to use that operating model? We actually operate as an employment agency in some countries because the law states that's what we have to do. So in Poland, we limit employment to 18 months in Poland, because after that period of time, the balance of responsibility tips to our customer in a way that we think it's not acceptable. The idea of using an employer of record is that you mitigate against your risk. But not every employer of record company will do that. A lot of employer of record companies are not so worried about their customers having risk. Said it a few times on the call. I'll say it again. We're selling a compliance product. Compliance is really important to us, and we always want to be able to look our customer in the eye and say, you should buy this product, you should use Boundless, because we will manage this risk for you, we will reduce risk, and we're doing all of this in an above board compliant way. But a real test is Spain. Employer record is not legal in Spain. It is expressly prohibited under Spanish law to outsource any of your responsibilities as an employer, except in very specific circumstances. And it tends to be only allowable for very seasonal, very short-term work. So most of the workers we're seeing, they're software engineers, designers, they're full-time employees, they're knowledge workers. The allowable situations in Spain don't really apply to these workers. So if an employer of record company supports employment in Spain, that is a red flag. It's an indication of how they view compliance. So asking them about that, asking them why they're okay with that, how they get around the legislation that states that a company cannot outsource responsibilities of employment to a third party, it can be illuminating how they answer that question. For us, we would love to support employment in Spain. We know it will be one of our most popular countries. There's huge demand for Spain. We're a compliance company, so we just don't support employment. It's not allowable.
Okay. Yeah, so it depends on specific country always. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Okay, so and probably maybe the last question from my side, real quick. Could you share maybe 3 tips for companies who are kind of new to this global hiring thing? What should they focus on for successful international hiring experience?
Such a good question. One, I would say, actually, it's not something we've covered today, but one area where there's real complexity when you have an international team is around pay. And I think a lot of companies that are earlier stage, maybe they're just setting out on their international hiring journey. Sometimes a company can be a bigger company with a big team, but they've never hired internationally before.
Yeah.
One of the things that the leaders have to figure out before they start hiring people internationally is what their approach will be on compensation. And this is really tricky. It's a topic I find really interesting. So there are a number of different ways of doing that. You might benchmark to a HQ country. If your HQ is San Francisco, you're probably not going to benchmark everyone to San Francisco salaries. For us, we benchmark everyone to Dublin. Or you might say it's always local market rated. So every country you go into, you look at what the average for a person in this role is paid. And you might say you want to be average, or you might want to say better than average, or maybe you need to be under average if control on costs is super important. But it's having a philosophy and an approach, writing it down and being consistent in how you run that, because otherwise you end up in a world, you think it's just one person here and one person there. Before you know it, you have this team of people all around the world, and they're all paid wildly different amounts, and it can be really difficult to manage. And then it can be really difficult when people want to move country. What happens? Do you adjust their pay? And you need to bear in mind that employer taxes in Denmark, for example, it's about 1.25% of the gross salary. Somewhere like France, that's going to be closer to 50%. So as a company, you have to be able to bear the costs that vary a lot depending on where people are. And then income taxes vary a lot. I'm based in Ireland. Our effective income tax is about 50%. So, your workers, depending on the country they're in, they might end up with a lot less take-home pay, or a lot more than their colleagues in other countries. And what's your approach going to be? So that's a really important one. Second one is around communication and collaboration. So it is, if you have a distributed team and you have a lot of people clustered at a HQ office and then other people distributed, you have the impact of that on your culture, but also on innovation and collaboration, how you actually work together. And creating a them and us is really problematic. And we've all done lots of talking about this over the past few years, co-located versus hybrid versus remote. But I was just having a conversation with someone this morning about having two locations that are kind of co-HQs. It can be really problematic because you get a lot of politics. You have to consider how people will work together, and it's really important, and it needs to be really intentional, that people who are distributed are not disadvantaged because they're not at the HQ office. And that's how you run meetings, making sure everyone always has their cameras on, making sure that everyone joins using their own camera. So it's not a group of people huddled around a boardroom table and then other people having a very different experience because they're just on camera. You asked me for 3. So third thing, when building a remote team, it's bringing people together. So giving people an opportunity to actually form relationships in real life. And that's a bit connected to the last thing I said. Magic happens when you bring people together. We do it 3 times a year with our team at Boundless. And you notice such a massive difference in people's relationships, their communication, and their productivity in the periods of time after everyone spent time together face to face.
Yeah, that's true. Okay, thank you, Dee, for joining us today and for sharing your valuable insights on this employer of record model, on the challenges of hiring internationally, right? And and just sharing how Boundless addresses these concerns, right? So I appreciate your time and expertise. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Really good to be with you today.
Absolutely. Thank you.